Welsh, the Woodland Carbon Code's Communications Officer. I'd like to welcome you all today and thank you for joining our webinar. Our presenters Andy Baker, Leon DeBell, Pippa Lewis and Jonathan Speed will update you on some of the key developments the Woodland Carbon Code team are working on at the moment. Andy will provide an overview of a wide range of projects. Then Leon will go on to speak about some developments in monitoring. Pippa will provide us an update on mapping developments, and Jonathan will talk about our buyer-seller contracts. We'll try to answer questions at the end of each section, so please do pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them as we go through the webinar. I'd also like to highlight that we're currently recording today's session for anyone who's unable to attend or if you'd like to watch it back. We'll make that recording available via our website. But for now, it's over to the Code's Senior Operational Manager, Andy.
Thanks, Susan. So I will share screen. I'm sure it'll all work flawlessly. If anyone can't see that, please do put it in the chat. But if during the presentation you do have any questions, as Susan says, do put them in the chat and we'll come to that after each of our sections. So just to jump straight into it. So as you know, there's loads going on at the code at the moment. You'll see a lot of consultations going out. And so I hope it's not too overwhelming, but there's a lot going on in the wider carbon industry as well. First of all, we are looking at improving our communication. Now, as many of you will know, we've recently concluded a communication survey, which was great, and we had some really good responses there. And it's useful to see that over time, compared to this time last year, people are far more comfortable and far happier with the code and the way the communications work and that sort of thing. So that's very good. And we're going to continue in that vein through a variety of means. First of all, we're wanting to continue with our webinar series. So this is one of many, and all of these are recorded and on our website. So you'll be able to look back and see what we're talking about lots of different projects. Next of all, we have our monthly newsletter, which keeps you up to date with all of the different goings on with the code and again in the wider carbon industry. So I hope you find those useful. We're also looking at developing our own dedicated LinkedIn presence. So that'll be a really useful way for us to communicate any updates to anyone interested in the code beyond the mailing list or beyond our project developer pool. We're also looking at updating the website. You might have seen some of these changes already, but we're trying to make things clearer, make things more accessible, that sort of thing. So watch this space. There'll be even more of that coming. And finally, we're looking at developing a dedicated channel for project developers in particular, for giving them updates on the code. We realize a lot of the time, some of the very, very pernickety, probably not the best way to describe it, but very focused changes that we're making may not be relevant to our entire mailing list. A carbon buyer may not be interested in a slight change to the way we do pre-validation mapping, for instance. So we're wanting to make that better and so have something more dedicated for that. So again, watch this space. Next of all, we're looking at more innovative monitoring, drones, remote sensing, LiDAR, that sort of thing. Fortunately, we've got Mr. Leon DeBell, who will be presenting on that later on, far better than I'll be able to do. After that, looking at template contracts for sellers and buyers. Again, Mr. Jonathan Speed will be giving us an update on that and a wide array of other legal issues. And we're also looking at improving the S&P registry. So there are two elements to this. First of all, the S&P registry is going to be updated over the next month or two. So a lot of you will see improvements in transparency, in accessibility and benefits across the board. It is a lot better. I've done a lot of sessions with them so far, and it's a lot better than it was before. On top of that, it's also worth noting that they will be doing some trial sessions and workshops that you can drop into to learn about the development to the registry, because it is often quite overwhelming seeing all of these things and not knowing how to navigate it. So they're providing a lot of support to make sure that you know how to navigate the new registry, and I think you'll be very pleased with the results. Second part to that is we are tendering for a new registry provider. We've come to the end of our contract with S&P this year, and so we will be tendering out. They will, I'm sure, be tendering for that as well, but it's open to anyone who is interested in that. We've already put out I can't remember what it's called, but we are imminently going to be releasing the full tender process. So again, watch this space. They'll all be included in our newsletter, in our mailing list. So you'll be able to see and be interested to see the different people that apply to that. So that'll be interesting moving forwards. Globally, a lot going on. So I don't know how many of you watch the global carbon space, but it's really important for us, of course, because having international accreditation is crucial in the credibility of our units. The credibility of our units is crucial in the demand side, the price of the units people are going to get. There's a big international body at the moment, the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. They are open to applications come April. So they had around last year for applications. And so different codes like the Peatland Code, Vera, that sort of thing applied then. We held back because there was someone answer the questions we had. And so we're looking to submit in April to the ICVCM. And that will allow us, if we pass that, to have the Core Carbon Principles label, the CCP label on our carbon credits. Now, for a lot of investment companies, a lot of buyers, they essentially are saying, without it, we're not interested. So it's really important we get that. But we want to make sure that when we submit, everything's on the up and up and that we're completely transparent. We know that we are going to be successful as much as we possibly can. So that's something we're working on at the moment. So again, we'll keep you updated with developments there. The VCMI I've included as well, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. That's on the buyer side. So that's a different initiative rather than the supply of the carbon credits. That's something focused on the people buying the carbon credits, essentially avoiding people greenwashing. So it's really useful having stuff like that as well. SBTI, Science Based Targets Initiative, BSI, lots of these different standards working together to really improve the credibility and the reputation of carbon markets more generally, which helps all of us. Next of all, just very briefly, before I hand over to Leon, to look at the other carbon methodologies being developed at the minute. A lot of you will have heard about the Agricultural Carbon Code, the Hedgerow Carbon Code, that sort of thing that we looked at last year. That's still in development, but it's not likely to be any revolutionary things in the next few months or so. But it is something that we're still looking at and wanting to make sure that any carbon gains from those sort of environmental sectors are accounted for. And the more we can bring into the carbon market, the better. The rewilding and kelp and seagrass, salt marsh carbon codes, all in development as well. The salt marsh carbon code is probably the closest to being released. I'm not entirely sure where they are, but they've done loads of development. It's a really exciting code to look into if you haven't already. Agroforestry, again, very similar to the silvopasture sort of stuff. What is the Woodland Carbon Code? What can we capture? Where does our remit end and it become agroforestry? That's quite an interesting point. The challenge for agroforestry quite often is just the volume of carbon units to make it economically viable. Not to say it's a non-starter by any means, it's just something to be aware of. Finally, we're also looking at stacking and or bundling. So as most of you will know, at the moment, any of our credits, any of our projects receive a score out of 5 for wildlife, water, economy, and what have I missed? Something, whatever it is. So they have to be community. It's there. So anyway, so for those 4 things, you get a score out of 5, and that is essentially an implicit bundle. So it's assumed that when you buy a carbon credit, bundled together with that carbon are all of these other benefits as well. There's a lot of work, as you know, on biodiversity standards being set up, a woodland water code potentially being set up as well, a community benefits standard or something along those lines is being looked at by the Soil Association. We currently actually have a biodiversity consultation that's open until the 17th of Feb, so I'd encourage you all to have a look on our website at that and get involved if you can. These are the sort of things that are hopefully going to improve the reputation of the code by being able to more accurately define this project has this amount of biodiversity improvement. Potentially that could lead to stacking, where you have a carbon unit and a biodiversity unit that can be sold separately, but at the moment they're all just in the early phases. So again, please feel free to engage on those different topics. That's it from me. So I wasn't sure if there are any questions at all yet. If not, let's have a look. So what were your unanswered questions about ICBCM and how have they been answered? So good question, Nick. So we had a few questions to ICBCM, some of them more generally looking at, okay, well, if we failed first time, how many iterations can we go through? What's the process for making any changes as we go? We haven't heard back from them on that as yet. And there are a couple of other things, such as in the ICVCM, it talks about a minimum project duration. The code, we don't technically have a minimum project duration, but we do insist it's UKFS compliant. It's going to be a permanent change in land use. Is that okay? Can a permanent change in land use be satisfy that criteria? That's another thing that we haven't yet heard back from, unfortunately. For ICVCM, bless them, they have been inundated over the last year. As you can imagine, every code and their dog have wanted to apply to the ICVCM, and so I think they've been incredibly stretched, and so it's quite hard for them to respond to all of the many tickets that have been put forward, and so I haven't heard back on some of those unanswered questions, but we are working through them, and I don't personally see anything as a showstopper where I'm like, oh, ICVCM require that, we're not even close to that, we'll be absolutely, there's no way we're going to be approved. We look as though we're almost there already, so any changes that are needed are likely to be minor tweaks. If there are no other questions for now, don't worry, you can always come back at the end and we can cover this later on. I'll pass over to Mr. Leon DeBell.
Thanks, Andy. Good afternoon, everyone. Time for the Microsoft Teams roulette, see if I can take control. It's not letting me do the... There we go. Okay, so the monitoring update is going to be a little bit different from what we did last year, because the last year I essentially went over and kind of talked about what we've been researching and looking into. This is more about what we've actually been doing over the past 12 months. So 4 main things. We've got CivTech, which some of you may or may not have heard about. We've got an EU Focus project, which is a European Space Agency funded project that we're involved in. We've got some miscellaneous bits of research that we've been conducting over the last 12 months. And then finally, just a kind of an introduction to a new 5-year verification remote sensing methodology, which I'll talk about at the end of this short presentation. Now, CivTech. Originally, when we planned this webinar, the exploration stage was due to have been started, and I would have had lots and lots to talk about. Now, unfortunately, we've had, it's just under 2 weeks now until the embargo, the communications embargo lifts. So I've actually got a lot less that I can talk about today than I initially planned. However, what I can say is we were part of CivTech 10, which is all around kind of technology and nature-based approaches. And we had a very successful kind of campaign as far as trying to recruit interest. We had 26 applicants in the end. That was taken down to 6 who went through to interview, and we had 4 applicants that went through to the accelerator phase. We're now looking to start the exploration phase, which is what I can't talk about. But what I would say is we do have the communication strategy in place, and Susan will be releasing press releases and things like that at the correct time, which I believe is the 3rd of February. Or it is as it stands. So I would just say, just to keep an eye out on what comes out from our communications channels in the next couple of weeks. But it's very exciting, looking forward to it. And next up is the EU Focus project. Now, this is being led by the National Physics Laboratory. And as we can see from this slide, there's quite a few organisations involved. And essentially what this is a Sentinel base, so the Sentinel satellites that are a European Space Agency cluster, they will be looked at to see how we can collectively apply a generic allometric model for European forests. So there's work that's been done in Finland, Portugal, here in the UK, and we've been acting as a champion for this project to provide contacts and hopefully some sites for the team to go out and apply remote sensing techniques to it. And essentially what's going to happen is they're going to be using terrestrial laser scanning to then upscale to the Sentinel data, whereby hopefully we'll have a more robust way of measuring growth and above ground biomass and subsequently carbon in European forests as a result of this. It's a 2.5-year project. We're about 4 months in, and hopefully in the next sort of 24 months, we should see something really positive come out of that. And then we've also been conducting our own sort of like, or being involved in some miscellaneous research over the last 12 months. We had initially planned to do our own kind of suite of drone remote sensing over some sites, but we had to make some kind of decisions as to where to put our focus, and CivTech kind of trumped our own kind of research. But we have still been involved in doing some side projects, again with the National Physics Laboratory in University College London, and they've been out with some of our team to do some 15-year Woodland Carbon Code sites using terrestrial laser scanners, and that's part of a master's project. And as part of that as well, some of our team have taken smartphones out to test apps. And this has been both looking at how the apps fare as far as scanning trees and also measuring trees, and whether these apps would actually be useful in a future scenario as a remote sensing option. There'll probably be more to follow on the apps, but so far we're not sure whether they actually provide any benefit over a traditional tape measure, but we'll see. And then the big one really is the 5-year verification. So this has been, we've been working on this for about 6 months, just kind of trying to put something together that will allow landowners, project developers, whoever it may be, to actually start using essentially drones as a remote sensing platform to help in the verification process. And we're nearly there. We've spoken to some project developers and we've spoken to the auditors, and it's gone through the rounds internally a few times, and there's been a very minimal amount of testing, but so far what we've seen from this methodology should provide an option for using drones at the 5-year verification stage, which is brilliant. However, the draft has gone out to our executive board. They need to review it, and we need to make sure that all the T's and I's are kind of crossed and dotted before we actually fully launch it. However, what we're really hoping is that come March, we'll be able to release something officially for a pilot stroke trial phase over the summer of 2025. If we do get the go ahead from the executive board and everything's fine, February, we should see some comms come out from us looking for some volunteer organisations to be involved that can actually trial this methodology, and then we can start to get some feedback to find out if it is a time cost saving exercise, but also for us internally to make sure that we can maintain the integrity of what we see the Woodland Carbon Code being as far as the verification process is concerned. And obviously we need to, there's ICVCM kind of regulations that we want to comply with. So we just need to make sure it all fits together, but it's looking very promising. And collectively what we've got from the last 12 months is over the next sort of 12 to 24 months, we should start to see a real push forward in the kind of digital transformation of the monitoring and verification within the Woodland Carbon Code. So it's all looking very positive, and kind of fingers crossed, things are all moving in the right direction, and hopefully we'll see some good progress. But I will take questions if anyone has any. I've just seen one pop up in the chat, so let's have a quick look.
While you're looking at that, Leon, I'll just answer Sasha's question on the bundling and stacking. So it's a really good question, Sasha. So we are looking completely broadly. So if there was something that allowed a completely separate biodiversity unit to be generated, then that could be something that we allow formal stacking, separation of those units. Whether that can be included in BNG in England is another matter. That's more an additionality question, particularly legal additionality. If you were to say that, well, BNG is a legal obligation, even though it's almost an indirect legal obligation, even though the person generating those biodiversity credits may be doing it voluntarily, the organisation buying them will be doing it compliance-wise or compulsorily. And so to allow for both voluntary carbon units to be generated alongside compliance BNG units might be an issue. It might not. It's something to explore, but at the moment it's more likely that it'd be two types of units, a biodiversity voluntary credit and a carbon voluntary credit at this point. Leon, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I've got a question from Nick. How do the TLS scan results compare to standard year 15 methodology results? E.g., for the same project, do they result in similar values, or does TLS suggest there is significantly more or less carbon stored? Good question. So the one of the reasons why we're working with the NPL and the UCL teams is they were on a study based at Whitton Woods in Oxford, and this was a mature stroke ancient woodland that's been studied for many years, and they applied TLS to it. And what they found was that the woodlands were storing anywhere up to about 1.7 times more carbon in than what had been traditionally calculated. Part of this is the way that historically we've used yield class, so trunk size, to kind of derive a carbon estimate. And there's a lot of stored carbon in the canopy. There's a big movement in academia and also in the kind of applied side of things, looking at tree mensuration and allometry and kind of furthering these studies with TLS. We have found so far that on the younger stuff, it's difficult because you need to get access, like a 15-year woodland plantation. The access might not necessarily be easy. And so the actual results from the TLS, we're unsure of at this stage. So it could be one of those tools whereby, although terrestrial laser scanning is absolutely going to be the gold standard for tree measurement and allometry outside of destructive testing, it's the age class that we'll need to understand where it's actually applicable. So it's not a kind of finalized result as yet. And certainly at the year 15 stage, it could really be something that might be superfluous just because of the difficulty of actually getting the equipment into a woodland compartment to do the measurement. So I would just say watch this space. We will be updating. So yes, thank you. Okay, we've just got another question coming in around assessing soil carbon. We're underestimating woodland carbon by 5 to 80 tonnes per hectare. So what progress has WCC made towards accounting for soil carbon? There is progress. I can't actually talk about it at the moment, unfortunately, but there is things happening in that space. So again, I would just say keep an eye on our comms in the coming weeks, and that question might start to be answered. Thank you. I will hand over to Pippa now.
Great, thanks very much, Leon. I'll just take control. Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am going to be giving an update on our Woodland Carbon Code spatial dataset. So this is something I've been working on probably for the past, 5-6 months now. So I'll just be giving you an update, kind of what our spatial dataset is going to look like, what's included in it, and where we'll be kind of publicizing it to on various different mapping platforms in the UK. So just to give a little bit of a background into this all, so on the left here, hopefully you can see my mouse, we've got a map of obviously the UK, and all of these different little green dots are representing Woodland Carbon Code projects. So basically what happens when someone submits a Woodland Carbon Code project, it gets registered, and then just before the validation stage, it enters a process called the pre-validation mapping process, and some of you might be aware of this. And it's at that stage that we basically digitize that Woodland Carbon Code project and add it to our spatial dataset. So on the right here, we have got an example of a Woodland Carbon Code project that has been digitized and has been added to our spatial dataset. So if you have a look at the red arrow, that's the kind of that's pointing to this digitized Woodland Carbon Code project. So we can, hopefully you'll be able to see, I know maybe the colors aren't the brightest, but you can see that there's different colors on that digitized project, and those different colors are relating to different classes. So we digitize your project using your PDF map that you have submitted. So when you submit your PDF map of your Woodland Carbon Code project, we ask for existing woodland to be drawn out. We ask for your planted areas, whether it's conifer or broadleaf, if it's possible to separate those. We ask for open ground, and we ask for natural regeneration areas as well. So all of that information that we ask for you to put into your Woodland Carbon Code PDF map, all of that gets digitized and spatially captured, and that is what those different colors are representing. So for this Woodland Carbon Code project, we've got this light green color, and that is representing planted broadleaf. We've got the purple colors, that is representing natural regeneration areas for this project. And then that creamy pale yellow color is representing the open ground for that project. So that's typically what a digitized Woodland Carbon Code project will look like. There we go. So we have some other data associated with each digitized Woodland Carbon Code project. So everything within your Woodland Carbon Code boundary gets digitized, but we also make a record of the project ID, the project name, the group ID and group name if relevant. As mentioned, anything that you've kind of put into your PDF map, those different classes, will get digitized as well and classified as either the conifer, if it's more than 80% of conifer planted in that area, broadleaf, more than 80%. If you've got areas that are mixed but predominantly conifer, we'll classify those out. Mixed predominantly broadleaf, we'll classify them out. Natural regeneration areas, open ground areas, and existing woodland areas will be classified out and digitized as well. So for each of those classes, there'll be an area in hectares associated with it. And as well for each Woodland Carbon Code project, it'll be given a status. So this can be 1 of 5. So under development, this is probably the one that is maybe least obvious. When you register your project, but before it gets validated, that is what we call a project that's under development. Then it can be validated, late to verify, not delivered, or verified. So just below is, I guess, a little mock-up example of how that data will be present in that spatial data set. So if some of you have worked with spatial data before, you'll know there's like an attribute table associated with it, and that's how it will all kind of be laid out, like in this little table below. So we've got our Woodland Carbon Code spatial data set in-house, but obviously we have shared it in the past. And so kind of why do we share it? There are a couple of reasons. So research is one of them. There's a kind of felling flag, which Jonathan has been doing quite a lot of work on. So in essence, if someone applies for a felling license, the felling team can kind of check that whether it's overlapping with a Woodland Carbon Code project or not, and if it is, various kind of flags can be raised just to make sure that everything is kind of above board, and also just to give everyone transparency of data set within the Woodland Carbon Code. All of the documents are publicly available, so we're just kind of following good practice guidelines, making our spatial data set publicly available as well. So there is a publicly available Woodland Carbon Code spatial dataset out there at the moment, but that was last updated in June 2023. So it was quite a while ago, and probably quite out of date now. So that's why it's taken me quite a few months. This kind of project that I've been working on, basically making sure our spatial data set is all as up to date as possible, adding all these new projects to it, and we will be releasing a new version and much more up-to-date version very shortly of the Woodland Carbon Code spatial data set publicly. So we don't want to wait nearly 2 years for every time that we release this spatial data set. We're hoping to make it a lot more frequently updated, so we're aiming for quarterly. So the one that will be released very quickly will be from January 2025, and then the next next data set, which we'll make publicly available, will be released in March 2025. So I mentioned, obviously, we're going to be making it publicly available across a variety of mapping platforms in the UK and an international platform as well. So this is the current list of different mapping platforms that we're looking to upload our Woodland Carbon Code spatial dataset onto. So you can see there's a few based on different countries within the UK. So we've got a couple in Scotland, a couple in England, and one in Wales and one in Northern Ireland. And then we've got a mapping platform that that hosts data for all of the UK. And then we've got a worldwide mapping platform as well, right at the bottom, which is the Esri Living Atlas one. So this is what we're currently planning to upload the Woodland Carbon Code spatial dataset onto. This isn't a definite list, so if anyone has any suggestions, if anyone thinks that we're missing out a mapping platform that you use that you think would be really useful to have this spatial dataset onto, then do just let us know. Maybe drop something in the comments, or feel free to just send us an email about it. That would be really useful. Okay, that's a whistle stop tour of the spatial dataset. I don't know if there's any questions that's come through. I'll have a quick look now. But if anyone does, yeah, just pop it in the chat.
That's great. Thanks, Pippa. Just wait for the slides to come over.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. I'll pass on to you.
That's great. Thank you. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. This was really just a quick introduction, I suppose, to a project we've been working on over the last 12 months or so, and are coming to the conclusion of it at the moment. It's a project that we've been working with alongside the Peatland Code team at IUCN UK and the Woodland Carbon Code team here at Scottish Forestry, alongside a team of 3 solicitors, Brodie's, Gillespie McAndrew and Turk and Connell. But it is to develop some template agreements for buying and selling both pending issuance units and carbon units under the Peatland Code and the Woodland Code. It's a project that's running over last year and over the next sort of 3 months left, and is supported and wholly funded through the Facility for Investment Ready Nature in Scotland, the catchily titled Ferns programme, which is funded through Nature Scot and Heritage Lottery Fund. The Heritage Fund part is important, as it does give us a UK-wide remit for the work that we're doing, so it isn't solely Scotland focused in that regard. Our purpose, quite simply, is to develop some template agreements for buyers and sellers of units, as I've mentioned. Initially, to provide a basis for contracting, to give an idea of how one might allocate responsibilities and obligations under the codes and that meet the requirements of the codes, and an approach to assigning risk and managing risk and liability over what could be a very long contract. Our project will come to an end in the next couple of months, and we published some draft versions of the agreements just prior to Christmas to people that have been involved in the project over the previous year, and we'll be making some amendments and updates to those in the next couple of months and publishing our final versions in March this year before the project closes. Sorry, too far. I guess the main reasons that we're trying to develop the template agreements and why we're doing them, essentially, it is to provide additional agreements as tools. They are templates as tools. They're not going to be a requirement of the codes to use these contracts. There won't be a compulsive element to them, and they will be provided at the end of the project as a wholly editable document that will be able to be downloaded from both the Peatland Codes site and the Woodland Carbon Code website, so able to be adapted and amended by any buyers or sellers in any particular project. I think we are aware very much that both markets, albeit the Woodland Carbon Code is slightly older than the Peatland Code, we're still in years maybe 15 to 20 on some projects, which in the life of the woodland is still pretty early in terms of permanence and getting the long-term carbon off the site. So we are aware that the market, I think, at the moment is still relatively young, and I suppose for my part, coming into this over the last year, there's relatively little tested legal precedent. I guess we've thankfully had not an awful lot go wrong with projects, which is really positive. But in trying to write some draft agreements and set precedent, it's great when things go wrong because people go to court and we can find out what the answer should have been. Not that we really want that to happen, I hasten to add. But I think we do see the contracts not necessarily as the end of the discussion, but at least the publication of perhaps an open and transparent document and something of a straw man that the sector can use to start to discuss what is a fair allocation of responsibilities and some of the risks and liabilities that arise in nature-based solutions as opposed to other forms of sequestration. So it is the start of that dialogue, I think, more than the end of it. It's worth noting again that we are seeking standardization of approach rather than standard setting. So the contracts do not push beyond the requirements of the code. There aren't additional things in there in terms of community benefits or other matters. They are issues for the codes to decide themselves. There is space to add your own things into the contracts, but the base contract is based around the codes as they presently stand. These are potentially contracts for very long-term agreements that could be decades long, 60, 70, 80 years long in some cases. And in no way do we expect or intend that the contracts should be used by projects that don't otherwise get appropriate commercial and legal advice. We're not intending to remove the need for legal advice on any specific projects. There's a fair few options in the contracts to be picked and chosen, and people will need to understand what works for them in their particular circumstance, whether the seller or buyer from that side. The contracts as drafted at the moment are specific to the peatland and woodland codes, and they are specific to the current versions of the codes. We are required under this project for the next 5 years to maintain the contracts, particularly in terms of updates to the code. If changes happen there, we will bring them into the contracts. If there's broader scenarios or other things we've not covered, then I think both codes will have to look at how they do that and how they look at that with resources. As I say, this first project has been wholly supported through the Ferns programme, which has been a fantastic resource to have, but obviously finishes shortly. It is particular to both of those codes, as I say, partly because they both share very similar architectures and overarching structure and size and shape and duration. There are themes and elements of the contracts and agreements that may well work for other nature markets as they emerge, but certainly the codes are obviously the more established ones and more easier to write contracts for, but they may well be learning from other projects. And we've been speaking to counterparts in the Ferns programme who are looking at very different projects around water and natural flood management, for instance, to see how applicable some of the codes and some of the clauses are within that. Our first versions of the contract that we put out for consultation are draft forms for Scots law only at this time, but we are currently working to adapt those to be applicable for England and Wales. We've pretty much done that first version now, and Northern Ireland in due course. They will follow as part of the final issue of the contracts in March this year, so they will work across all of the 4 home nations, just to be clear. I suppose the final point on that is that they will work within each of the 4 nations. We don't. If you're doing a cross-border project, I'm not quite sure anybody has yet, but you will need to decide as to which jurisdiction and which courts you wish to be bound by in that regard. In working through the contract over the last sort of 6 or 9 months with the team of solicitors, we have essentially settled on 2 forms of contract. There is one for the pending issuance units and one for verified peatland and woodland carbon units. We had, I think, throughout the process of developing the agreements, we've been endeavouring to keep the amount of options to as few as possible and the amount of agreements to a smaller number as possible. But ultimately, there's a very particular nature of PIUs versus verified units in terms of what happens in the event of change over a project's life, whether that's change of ownership of either party, or whether it's a project performing less well than expected, so less units verified and less PIUs converting to verified units, and in the event of loss of the woodland or damage to the peatland. So we have ended up with 2 discrete forms. They do share an awful lot of the structure and drafting, obviously, between the 2 of them, but they have been set up initially for consultation as providing 2 relatively contrasting degrees of complexity and optionality, but that is something that we can take a view on once we get comments back. It's worth noting that both agreements still allow people to enter into an agreement between buyer and seller at a very early stage on the project, so potentially pre-registration and before the issue of PIUs all the way to post-validation. We aren't providing for a scenario whereby sellers and buyers are contracting to buy already verified units. That's very much more of a retail scenario and a retail agreement, which ought to be much simpler, so we haven't developed that as part of this project. We focus on the slightly more complex ones whereby people are engaging over a much longer period of time. In all cases, the seller is presumed to be the person with an appropriate controlling interest in the land. That needn't necessarily be the owner. Within that, we do provide for tenants, and that they have the rights, obviously, to the PIUs or the verified units in the first instance. The buyer is also presumed to be ordinarily the first purchaser of those units, and they may or may not be the sole buyer on that site. So we have options around exclusivity in the contract or not. But we do also, they allow for alienation and transfer of rights in the contract. So the buyer may not end up being the first buyer as schemes progress over a long period of time. In trying to structure the agreement, we've endeavoured to keep the bits that people have to edit which are relatively small areas. So we broke it into 3 main parts. There's a commercial term sheet at the front end, which captures core information about the project, and that's where I guess a layperson, myself not being a legal person, would start to pick the main options and clauses that we're going to use in the contract, the main issues around termination, our approach to pricing, timing and those kind of events. And then at the back end of the contract, there is space for schedules to go in, which is the detailed project information, which is designed really to be drawn from stuff that projects will already be preparing for documents and for registration. So we're not trying to create whole new sets of information that need to be pulled together. We're trying to keep it pretty simple. As I mentioned, we try to keep options in the contracts to a relatively small number, but we do have a number that sit in there, and they focus, as on the list on the right. So around buyer exclusivity, we have long stop dates that allow for projects contracting early to make sure works are done on time and they're validated and go through to delivery. We have approaches to the price and payment of a unit, whether that payment is split over a number of tranches. I think in the PRU one it's 4. In the verified unit agreement, I think it's 2 from memory, and also how that price is fixed over time, given that some units would not arrive till years 30, 40, 50. They can be indexed or linked to market rates or simply fixed at the outset. We also do some treatment of changes as to when projects perform well or better, whether that's at validation and verification and underperformance, and some termination instances as noted. But we've also accounted, given the length of these projects, for who might bear the risk of change in both UK law or Scots law, but also in change in the codes. I know it is an issue that has been raised a number of times around how the code develops over time and what happens with projects on that. So we've done our best to account, at least provide a solution to that at the moment. We have a limited amount around insurances and an option for standard securities, which will be amended for England because it doesn't quite apply in the same way. And for longer projects where buyers have exclusivity, we have an option for step-in rights within there and more conventional options around access rights and publicity between the two parties. I suppose the last thing to say really again is that our project is wrapping up in the next couple of months, so our final forms will come out in March 25. We've got drafts out at the moment that we've been putting out for the last 5-6 weeks or so. If people would like to receive those, I think Susan's just putting a note in there, but they can request the drafts and put a survey form back to us to give us their views. We'd be very grateful to receive any of those. But again, if you'd like to receive the final forms when they come out, then do drop us a line and make sure you sign up to the newsletter in due course, because it should be coming out sort of early to mid-March. We should publish the final forms of those. I'll just check the chat. I don't think there's any questions in there at the moment. Probably a bit too whistle stop and a bit detailed, but by all means, ask for copies of the contracts. They are quite long. Take your time, read them through, and come back with questions if there are. Hopefully that was useful. I'll hand back to Susan at this point.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So I think we've come to the end of our presentations. If there's any final questions, please do pop them into this chat and we'll pick them up before we finish up. I'm also just going to drop a poll into the chat just to ask you how you found today's webinar. We're always looking to improve, so if you can take a second to complete that, that'd be fantastic. There we go. Oh. I'm not sure if that's working, but anyway, I'll carry on. So yeah, thanks all for your presentations, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's been a really useful update. I hope everyone's found it to be interesting. Before we finish up, I'd just like to highlight our next webinar, and that's going to take place on Tuesday, the 25th of February. That will be a joint webinar with the Peatland Code team, and that will be all on the topic of selling Woodland and Peatland Code units. So you can find out details about that webinar on our website in the news and events section, or you can also find the details in our newsletter, which you can subscribe to from our website. So all that's left for me to do is to thank you very much for your time today. Thank our excellent speakers, Pippa, Jonathan, Andy and Leon, and just to thank you again, and hope that we'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.